Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Skull and Hat's Tales. I'm always curious to know where the people who watch this channel are from. So before you relax, consider leaving a comment. Now, let's get started. The building had always been familiar to me, a maze of hallways and staircases I thought I had memorized. Whether it was routine trips to my office or aimless walks during breaks, I knew its quirks. The flickering lights on the third floor, the faint smell of mildew in the stairwell, the creak of a certain door hinge near the basement. It was an old structure, weathered by time, but it was predictable, or so I thought. One afternoon, as I wandered aimlessly, I found myself on the second floor near the storage rooms. The air was heavier there, thick with the scent of cleaning supplies and stale cardboard. It was quiet, too, the kind of silence that makes every footstep sound deafening. I was halfway down the corridor when I noticed it. A door I had never seen before. It was unmarked, its surface plain and slightly scuffed. I stopped, staring at it, my mind racing to recall if it had always been there. I approached cautiously, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The metal was cool to the touch, and the door opened smoothly, without resistance or sound. Behind it was a staircase descending into shadow. A part of me hesitated, instinct whispering that this was a place I wasn't meant to go. But curiosity has a way of overriding caution. I stepped inside, letting the door click shut behind me, and began my descent. The stairs ended in a dimly lit room, colder than the hall above. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a sickly glow over the space. Metal shelves lined the walls, stacked with identical brown boxes. At first glance, it looked like storage for office supplies or janitorial equipment, but something about it felt off. I moved cautiously between the shelves, my eyes scanning the boxes. There were no labels, no markings to indicate what they held. I reached for one, hesitating before prying it open. Inside, neatly packed rows of vials and syringes gleamed under the light. The labels on the vials were handwritten, their contents marked with cryptic codes that made no sense to me. Another box revealed blister packs of pills, their packaging unfamiliar and devoid of any branding. I opened another, then another, finding more of the same, medicines, syringes, and equipment that seemed both clinical and illicit. My heart raced as I tried to make sense of it. What was this place? Who was storing these items here, and why? The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I suddenly felt exposed, as if I were being watched. I turned toward the staircase, instinctively ready to leave, when I heard it, a faint but unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching. Panic gripped me as the footsteps grew louder, echoing down the staircase. My first thought was to run, but there was no time. I ducked behind a stack of boxes, crouching low and holding my breath. The room fell silent, except for the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. The door creaked open, and someone stepped inside. Their shoes scuffed against the concrete floor, moving with purpose. I stayed frozen, peeking through a gap in the boxes. The person was dressed in dark clothing, their face obscured by a hood. They didn't seem to notice me, their focus fixed on the shelves. I watched as they selected one of the boxes, lifting it effortlessly and setting it on the floor. They opened it briefly, rummaged through its contents, and muttered something under their breath, too soft for me to make out. After a moment, they closed the box and hoisted it onto their shoulder. Without another glance, they walked back toward the door. Relief washed over me as they exited, but it was short-lived. I heard the click of a lock, and my stomach dropped. I was trapped. The room felt colder now, the silence more oppressive. I stayed hidden for several minutes, my mind racing through possibilities. Could I scream for help? Would anyone hear me? The thought of being discovered down here, caught in a room I had no business being in, made my chest tighten. I needed to get out. Emerging from my hiding spot, I scanned the room for another exit. The door was solid metal, its lock mocking me with its impenetrable design. My eyes darted to the corners of the room, searching for anything, a window, a panel, anything that might lead to freedom. That's when I noticed the vent. It was tucked away near the floor, the grate secured with screws. I knelt down, inspecting it. The screws were old, the metal rusted. With enough force, I might be able to pry it open. I searched the shelves and found a crowbar among the clutter, its surface pitted with age but still functional. Every sound I made felt deafening, the scraping of the crowbar against the screws echoing in the stillness. After what felt like an eternity, the grate came loose, and I stared into the darkness of the vent beyond. It was narrow, barely wide enough to fit through, but it was my only option. I didn't hesitate. Pulling myself into the vent, I began to crawl, the metal walls pressing against me on all sides. The further I went, the more I felt the air grow warmer, the faint sound of machinery humming in the distance. Every inch forward felt like a victory, but the fear of what might lie ahead kept me moving. The vent was tighter than I had anticipated. My elbows scraped against the cold metal as I crawled, each movement slow and deliberate. The faint hum of machinery echoed through the narrow passage, growing louder as I advanced. The air was stifling, filled with the metallic tang of rust and something acrid that made my throat itch. I forced myself to keep moving, though the confinement of the space clawed at my nerves. Every few feet, I paused to listen, straining for any sound of pursuit. The fear of being discovered outweighed the discomfort, pushing me forward despite my growing exhaustion. My hands and knees ached from the unyielding metal beneath me, but I didn't dare stop. At one point, I reached a junction in the vent, a fork leading in two directions. To my left, the air felt warmer, the hum of machinery more pronounced. To my right, there was a faint draft, cooler and promising. I turned right, following the promise of fresh air and freedom. The further I crawled, the more the draft grew, lifting my spirits just enough to keep me going. Finally, I saw it, a faint sliver of light ahead, filtering through another grate. My pulse quickened as I scrambled toward it, ignoring the pain in my knees and hands. The light grew brighter until I reached the end of the vent. The grate was bolted, but the screws were rusted and loose. I pressed against it, forcing it to budge, until with a metallic groan, it gave way, tumbling to the floor below. I lowered myself carefully from the vent, landing in a crouch on a dusty tile floor. The room I had emerged into was dimly lit, its fluorescent lights flickering weakly. It appeared to be a maintenance area, cluttered with old tools, empty crates, and coils of wire. The air here was slightly fresher, though it carried the same faint chemical scent I had noticed earlier. I glanced around, trying to orient myself. There were no windows, only a single door across the room. It was slightly ajar, revealing a hallway beyond. The space felt abandoned, but I moved cautiously, every step calculated and quiet. My ears were attuned to every sound, every creak of the floor beneath my weight. The hallway stretched ahead, its walls lined with peeling paint and exposed pipes. I kept to the shadows, my nerves on edge. The further I went, the more I felt the oppressive weight of the building pressing down on me. Each turn revealed another stretch of dimly lit corridors, each one indistinguishable from the last. Eventually, I found a staircase leading upward. I climbed it quickly, my heart pounding with both exertion and fear. When I reached the top, I pushed through a heavy metal door and stumbled into a brightly lit corridor. The sudden change in light and atmosphere was disorienting. I recognized this part of the building. It was the ground floor. The familiarity of the ground floor was jarring, as though I had stepped into a different world entirely. The polished floors and soft hum of fluorescent lights contrasted sharply with the cold, dim space I had just escaped. For a moment I stood frozen, disoriented by the normalcy of it all. People walked by, their conversations mundane, their footsteps unhurried. I straightened my clothes, wiping the dust from my hands and knees as best I could. My heart still raced, but I forced myself to blend in, moving toward the exit with measured steps. No one paid me any attention, and for that, I was grateful. I didn't want to explain why I looked disheveled or why my eyes darted nervously to every corner of the room. As I exited the building, the crisp air hit me like a slap. The sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the pavement. I walked quickly, putting as much distance as I could between myself and the building. My thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and fear, but I pushed them aside, focusing solely on getting away. By the time I reached my apartment, my exhaustion caught up with me. I collapsed onto the couch, my mind replaying the events over and over. The hidden room, the medicines, the syringes, it all felt surreal, like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. My walk home every evening was as predictable as the route itself. The path cut through the quieter parts of town, weaving past a closed library, dimly lit streets, and a small, deserted playground. The playground was always a curious landmark, empty at night, its swings motionless in the breeze, its slide catching faint reflections of the distant streetlights. I never gave it much thought, but it was always there, a harmless relic of daytime liveliness. One night, as I approached, I noticed something unusual. A figure, barely illuminated by the faint glow of the streetlights, moved quickly away from the playground. The shape seemed hurried, their shadow stretching unnaturally across the ground before disappearing around a corner. The sight made me pause, my steps faltering as I tried to make sense of it. Why would anyone linger here at this hour? The swings swayed slightly in the breeze, the creak of their chains oddly louder than usual. The playground seemed unchanged, as empty as always. Shrugging off the odd encounter, I continued on my way, quickening my pace without realizing it. Still, the image of that figure lingered in my mind. The next evening, I approached the playground with a strange sense of anticipation, half expecting to see the figure again. At first, everything appeared normal, the silence of the night, the stillness of the swings. But as I neared, I spotted someone. They were standing just beyond the playground, partially obscured by the shadows of the trees. Unlike the fleeting figure I had seen the night before, this person wasn't moving. They stood perfectly still, their face hidden by the darkness, yet I could feel their gaze. It was an unshakable sensation, as if their eyes bore into me from across the distance. I kept walking, pretending not to notice. My heart raced as I passed, the weight of their stare following me long after the playground had disappeared from view. I fought the urge to look back, afraid of what I might see. The rest of the walk home felt stretched, each step heavy with the unsettling feeling of being watched. That night, I lay in bed, replaying the scene in my mind. The figure had been too far away to make out any details, but their presence had been deliberate, almost menacing. I told myself it was nothing, just someone passing through, but the unease lingered. The following evening, I found myself dreading the walk home. The playground, once an afterthought, had become an unwelcome milestone on my route. Still, I convinced myself to stick to the usual path, reasoning that avoiding it would only fuel my unease. When I reached the playground, it was eerily quiet. Not just the absence of people, but a suffocating kind of silence that seemed to blanket the area. The swings hung lifelessly, and the slide gleamed faintly under the dim light, but something felt wrong. The air seemed heavier, the shadows deeper, as if the place itself was holding its breath. I hurried past, my eyes fixed on the ground ahead. Yet, even as I tried to ignore the playground, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me. The silence was so complete that every rustle of leaves or distant hum of traffic felt amplified. I glanced back briefly, half expecting to see the figure again, but the playground was empty. The rest of the walk home was plagued by unease. My thoughts raced with questions I couldn't answer. What was it about that playground? Why did it feel so different now, so threatening? I couldn't explain it, but I knew this wasn't over. It was late when I found myself approaching the playground again, the streets unusually quiet. I told myself I wouldn't look, wouldn't let my imagination get the better of me. But as I neared, the playground's emptiness drew my attention like a magnet. There was no one there, no figures lingering in the shadows, no sudden movements or hurried departures. Relief washed over me, and I quickened my pace, eager to leave the unsettling spot behind. But then I heard it, a faint shuffle, like feet brushing against the ground. I turned sharply, my breath catching. At first I saw nothing, but as I scanned the area, movement flickered at the edges of my vision. Shadowy shapes, indistinct and fluid, began to emerge from the darkness around the playground. They didn't move like people. Their forms shifted unnaturally, blending with the shadows as they drifted closer. My pulse thundered in my ears as I took a step back. The figures stayed at a distance, always on the periphery, yet their presence was undeniable. I turned and began walking quickly down the path, my skin crawling with the sense that they were following me. Each time I glanced back, they remained just out of reach, silent and unrelenting. I walked faster, my breath shallow and my eyes darting nervously over my shoulder. The figures stayed at the edge of my vision, slipping between shadows, their movements too fluid to be entirely human. Each step I took seemed to pull them closer, though they never crossed the invisible boundary that kept them just far enough to remain indistinct. It felt like a game, one where the rules were known only to them. The path stretched ahead of me, dimly lit by spaced-out streetlights that cast pools of faint illumination. Each time I reached a pool of light, I felt a momentary reprieve, the figures pausing in their pursuit as though reluctant to step into the glow. But as soon as I moved forward into the shadows, they resumed, gliding noiselessly closer. I tried to convince myself it wasn't real. Maybe the flickering of the streetlights was playing tricks on my eyes, or the trees swaying in the night breeze created illusions. But the rhythmic feeling of being followed, the weight of their presence, was undeniable. The silence around me was suffocating, broken only by my hurried footsteps and the faint rustling behind me. I stopped abruptly, spinning around to confront them. My heart pounded as I scanned the empty path. Nothing. Just the shadows of the playground in the distance. For a moment, I thought they were gone, but as I turned back to continue walking, I saw it, a faint, shifting shape at the very edge of the light, closer now than before. I broke into a jog, my nerves fraying with every step. The figures didn't run, but their movements seemed faster, more deliberate, as though they knew I was starting to panic. The path ahead seemed to narrow, the streetlights growing sparser as the shadows closed in. I glanced back again and froze. There were more of them now, their forms blending seamlessly with the darkness. They weren't just following me, they were closing the distance, drawing together like a tide rolling in. I felt the weight of their collective presence bearing down on me, an oppressive force that pressed against my chest and quickened my pulse. Their movements were erratic yet calculated, as though they were herding me towards some unseen destination. I had no choice but to keep moving, my legs trembling with the effort to stay ahead. The air grew colder, the night seeming to fold in on itself as I approached the final stretch of the path. The familiar glow of the last streetlight, the one marking the exit to the main road, seemed impossibly far away. My breath came in ragged gasps, my body screaming for rest, but I couldn't stop. The figures were closer now, the sound of their movement barely audible but unmistakable. With a final burst of energy, I sprinted toward the light. The oppressive darkness around me seemed to peel away as I stepped into its glow. For a moment, the world felt normal again. I stopped, turning to face the path behind me, expecting to see the figures just beyond the edge of the light. But there was nothing. The path was empty, the playground in the distance a silent silhouette. The figures had vanished, as though they had never been there. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my breath hitching as I scanned the shadows for any sign of movement. The playground remained still, its swings and slide bathed in faint moonlight. The oppressive silence had lifted, replaced by the distant hum of cars on the main road. Relief trickled in slowly, but it was far from comforting. I took a hesitant step forward, then another, my legs shaky from the adrenaline still coursing through me. The figures were gone, but their presence lingered, an invisible weight that pressed against my mind. I walked toward the safety of the streetlights and the sound of civilization, constantly glancing over my shoulder. When I finally reached the main road, I paused to catch my breath. Cars passed by, their headlights sweeping over the sidewalk, illuminating the world in sharp bursts of normalcy. The sight of other people, unaware of the nightmarish experience I had just endured, was almost jarring. I told myself I was safe now. The figures couldn't follow me here, but the thought felt hollow, as though safety was merely an illusion. The open road stretched endlessly ahead of me, flanked by dense woods and the occasional empty field. My GPS showed the next gas station just a few miles away, and I couldn't have been more relieved. My car had been sputtering for the past hour, and with each mile, the warning light on the dashboard glared brighter. I prayed the engine would hold out just a little longer. Then it didn't. A sudden jolt shook the car, and the engine coughed before falling silent. I coasted to a stop on the shoulder, the stillness around me unnerving after hours of engine noise. I tried the ignition, but the car refused to start. Panic simmered at the edges of my mind, but the glowing GPS reassured me. The gas station was close, just a quick walk, according to the screen. Leaving the car locked, I pocketed the keys and headed down the road. The night air was cool, the only sounds the faint chirping of crickets and the rustling of leaves. After a few minutes of walking, I spotted the outline of what I assumed was the gas station. Relief washed over me as I quickened my pace, but as I got closer, my optimism began to fade. What I found wasn't a gas station, it was an overgrown lot. The lot was unkempt, swallowed by tall weeds and vines that climbed over rusted machinery. The outline of an old fuel pump jutted out like a skeleton from the earth, its faded paint barely visible under the foliage. The remains of a small building stood in the corner, its roof sagging and its windows shattered. A warped sign hung from a post, its letters so weathered they were unreadable. My footsteps slowed as I took in the scene. It was clear no one had used this place in decades, yet the GPS had shown it as an operational station, and that lingering detail gnawed at me. I checked my phone, but now the screen displayed a frustrating no signal. Typical. Curiosity got the better of me. Maybe there was something salvageable here. Tools, fuel, anything to help me get back on the road. I pushed through the overgrowth, the crunch of leaves underfoot loud in the eerie silence. The air felt heavy, the kind of stillness that makes you hyper-aware of your own movements. As I rounded the corner of the dilapidated building, I froze. Faint voices drifted toward me from deeper within the lot. The voices were low and muffled, their words indistinct but laced with urgency. I couldn't see where they were coming from, but the sound seemed to grow louder the longer I listened. My instinct screamed to leave, but my feet remained rooted. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere, at an abandoned station? I crept closer, my movements careful and deliberate. Peering around the corner of the building, I spotted them. Two men standing near what looked like a rusted shed at the edge of the lot. The moonlight illuminated their figures just enough for me to make out their sharp gestures. They were arguing, their voices growing louder as one of them jabbed a finger toward the other's chest. Something about the scene didn't feel right. The way they moved, the way their voices carried, it was unnerving. I wanted to turn back, but before I could retreat, one of them noticed me. His head snapped in my direction, and the argument ceased instantly. Both men stood motionless, their faces obscured by the shadows. "Hey there!" one of the men called out, his voice smooth and disarming. His companion elbowed him, muttering something I couldn't hear. The man ignored it, stepping forward slightly, his hands raised in a non-threatening gesture. "You lost? Need some help?" Every instinct in me screamed not to answer, but my throat felt dry, my words stuck. I managed to shake my head, taking a small step backward. "Don't worry," he continued, his tone dripping with false friendliness. "We're just passing through, same as you. No need to be nervous." His companion took a step forward as well, his movements slow and deliberate. "Yeah," he added, his voice lower and rougher. "Looks like your car broke down. We can help." I finally found my voice. "No, I'm fine, just looking around." The first man chuckled, a sound that didn't quite match his smile. "Looking around, huh? Not much to see here." He gestured to the lot. "Come on, why don't you step over here? We've got some tools in the shed, might be able to fix your problem." I shook my head again, my heart hammering against my ribs. Their words were friendly, but their eyes betrayed them, sharp, calculating, and far too interested in me. I took another step back, my hands shaking. "Thanks, but I need to get back to my car." The smooth talker's smile faltered, his expression twisting briefly into something darker. His companion muttered again, this time more urgently, but I didn't wait to hear what he said. I turned and bolted toward the road, their voices calling after me. I sprinted back toward the road, the overgrown grass and uneven ground threatening to trip me with every step. Behind me, the men's voices rose, their smooth facade replaced by sharp commands. "Wait! Don't run!" one of them shouted, but the urgency in his tone only fueled my panic. Reaching the edge of the lot, I risked a glance over my shoulder. The men weren't far behind, their movements quick and unnervingly deliberate. The moonlight illuminated their figures briefly, and something about the way they moved made my skin crawl. They were too coordinated, too fluid, as if they weren't entirely human. My car came into view just ahead, a beacon of safety. The sight gave me a burst of energy, and I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning. My mind raced with fragmented thoughts. Who were those men? What were they arguing about? And why did they care that I had seen them? The overgrown lot and its strange occupants no longer felt like a coincidence. The rusted pumps, the abandoned station, and the GPS directing me there, it all felt deliberate, like a trap carefully laid out and waiting for me. I reached the car, fumbling with the keys as my hands shook uncontrollably. The men were still behind me, but they had slowed, their movements purposeful as they approached the edge of the lot. I could feel their eyes on me, cold and piercing, even as I ducked into the driver's seat. "Don't leave," one of them called, his voice almost pleading. "We can help you." The words carried an unsettling weight, as if they held more meaning than I could understand. Ignoring them, I jammed the key into the ignition, my heart sinking as the engine sputtered weakly. "Come on," I muttered under my breath, turning the key again. The engine roared to life, and relief flooded through me. The men stepped closer, their expressions obscured by shadow, but I could see enough to know they were furious now. The smooth talk had been replaced by something colder, more primal. One of them raised an arm, as if signaling something or someone in the distance. I didn't wait to find out. Slamming the car into gear, I peeled out onto the road, the tires screeching against the asphalt. My headlights sliced through the darkness, illuminating the empty stretch ahead. I drove without looking back, the weight of their gaze lingering like a physical presence. The road seemed endless, winding through dense woods with no sign of civilization. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, the adrenaline still coursing through me. Every shadow along the roadside felt alive, every sound magnified by my racing thoughts. I checked the rearview mirror obsessively, expecting to see headlights or figures chasing after me. But the road behind remained dark and empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that the men, or whatever they were, hadn't given up so easily. Eventually, the trees thinned and distant lights appeared on the horizon. A small town came into view, its quiet streets bathed in the warm glow of streetlights. I pulled into the first gas station I saw, a real one this time, and parked beneath the canopy. The normalcy of the place was jarring. A bored attendant stood behind the counter, scrolling on their phone, oblivious to my panic. I stayed in the car, trying to calm my breathing, but the memory of the overgrown lot and the men's sharp voices refused to fade. I glanced at my GPS again, half expecting it to redirect me back to that cursed station, but it had reset itself, the marker gone, as if it had never existed. It was an ordinary afternoon, the kind that blended into countless others. I was walking through the park, headphones in, lost in thought, when someone stepped into my path. A man, well-dressed but slightly disheveled, held up a clipboard with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Excuse me," he said, his voice warm but oddly insistent. "I'm with a local charity organization, and we're raising awareness for an important cause." I hesitated, debating whether to brush him off, but his demeanor was disarming. He seemed genuine, his tone friendly yet professional. He launched into a brief explanation about their mission, something vague about helping at-risk communities. I wasn't fully listening, but I nodded along politely. Then his questions began. At first they were standard. Do you live in the area? Have you heard of our organization before? But soon they turned oddly personal. What's your daily schedule like? Do you usually walk here alone? Do you have family nearby? The shift was subtle, but I felt it immediately. My answers grew shorter, more guarded, as I glanced around, hoping for an excuse to leave. But he didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't care. "We're holding an open house tomorrow at our headquarters," he said, handing me a card. "It's a great opportunity to see the work we do firsthand. You'd fit right in." I took the card reluctantly, muttering a vague excuse to leave. His smile lingered as I walked away, but when I glanced back, he was still watching me, his expression unreadable. At home, I tossed the card onto the table, intending to forget about it. But later that evening, curiosity got the better of me. I picked it up, examining it more closely. The card was strangely plain, just the name of the organization, the address, and the date of the open house. No phone number, no website, no logo. Something about it felt off. I typed the charity's name into a search engine, expecting to find a professional website or at least a social media page, but nothing came up. No reviews, no photos, no mentions, just a void where any reputable organization should have left a digital footprint. My unease deepened. Why would someone go to the trouble of soliciting donations or inviting people to a non-existent organization? My thoughts wandered back to the man's questions, how specific and invasive they had been. He hadn't asked for money, which was even stranger. What did he really want? Despite my better judgment, I decided to visit the address the next day. Maybe I was overthinking it, letting my paranoia get the better of me. Or maybe I needed to confirm that my instincts were right. The next evening, I arrived at the address printed on the card. It was far from the bustling park where I'd met the man, tucked away in a desolate part of the city. The neighborhood felt lifeless, its streets lined with empty storefronts and decaying buildings. The address led me to a large, decrepit structure. The windows were shattered, the walls streaked with grime, and the faint smell of mildew hung in the air. This couldn't be right. I double-checked the card, but the numbers matched. Standing there, I considered leaving. The building was clearly abandoned, and nothing about it suggested a functioning charity. But something compelled me to push forward. Curiosity, stubbornness, or perhaps the nagging need to confirm that something wasn't right. The front door creaked open easily, its hinges protesting as I stepped inside. The interior was just as decayed as the exterior, with peeling paint and debris littering the floor. Yet there were signs of recent activity, footprints in the dust, an empty coffee cup on the windowsill, and faint scratches on the walls. A stairwell at the back of the lobby beckoned me upward. The card had mentioned the top floor, and despite the growing knot of unease in my stomach, I began to climb. The stairwell felt endless, each step echoing ominously in the silence. The air grew colder as I ascended, and the faint creak of the building settling sent shivers down my spine. When I finally reached the top floor, I paused to catch my breath, the unease now a steady thrum in the back of my mind. That's when I heard it, the sound of a door creaking open below. My breath caught as I crouched near a broken window, peering down into the dim light of the lobby. A group of hooded men entered, their movements deliberate and coordinated. They carried bags, the contents hidden but heavy enough to strain their postures. They didn't speak, their silence more unnerving than any conversation would have been. One of them paused and looked up, his face obscured by the shadow of his hood. My heart raced as I ducked lower, pressing myself against the wall. I couldn't see his expression, but I felt his gaze sweep the room, searching. Panic gripped me. I had walked straight into something dangerous, and now I was trapped. My eyes darted to the window, where the adjacent building loomed just a few feet away. It wasn't a perfect option, but it was the only one I had. The room seemed to shrink around me as I tried to process what I'd just seen. The hooded men below moved with a strange sense of purpose, their silence unsettling. From my vantage point, I watched as they began setting their bags down and unpacking their contents, boxes, tools, and something else I couldn't quite make out in the dim light. It all clicked in that moment. The man from the park, his invasive questions, the strange invitation to this decrepit building. This wasn't a charity. Whatever they were doing here, it was far from anything legitimate. The sense of danger was overwhelming, and I knew I had to get out before they realized I was there. I stayed low, crawling toward the broken window. My heart pounded as I peered out at the adjacent building, a worn brick structure just a few feet away. Its roof was level with the window, and the gap between the two buildings seemed manageable, if I was careful. The sound of footsteps on the stairwell below jolted me into action. They were coming up. I climbed onto the window ledge, gripping the frame tightly as I gauged the jump. The night air was cold against my skin, and the drop to the alley below was dizzying. One wrong move, and I wouldn't have to worry about the hooded men anymore. Voices echoed from the stairwell, closer now. I couldn't wait any longer. Taking a deep breath, I pushed off the ledge with all the strength I could muster. The gap was wider than I'd thought, and for a heart-stopping moment, I felt weightless, suspended in the air. I hit the roof of the adjacent building hard, the impact jarring and sending me sprawling. My hands scraped against the rough surface, and I bit back a cry as pain shot through my knees. But I didn't have time to dwell on it. Scrambling to my feet, I glanced back at the window I'd just leapt from. One of the hooded men had reached the top floor. He stood at the broken window, his face obscured by shadow, but his posture radiated anger. For a brief moment we locked eyes, or at least I felt his gaze pierce through the darkness. Then he turned and shouted something to the others. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran across the rooftop, searching for a way down. The building I'd jumped to was in slightly better shape than the one I'd just fled, but it was still old and creaking under my hurried steps. I found a rusted fire escape on the far side and began my descent, each step rattling and threatening to give way. My hands gripped the cold metal rails tightly, and I forced myself not to look down. When my feet hit the pavement, I didn't stop. I sprinted through the alley and onto the main street, where the soft glow of streetlights and the faint hum of distant traffic offered a semblance of safety. I checked behind me constantly, expecting to see the hooded men chasing me, but the alley remained empty. Only when I reached my apartment did I feel the adrenaline begin to fade. My hands trembled as I locked the door behind me and slid the chain into place. The reality of what had just happened hit me all at once, and I slumped against the wall, my breathing ragged. I was safe. It was late evening, and I was halfway through a mindless TV show when my phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar, but curiosity got the better of me. I picked up, expecting a telemarketer or wrong number. "Hello," I said. "Ah, there you are," a calm, unfamiliar voice replied. "Is this Sarah?" "No," I said cautiously. "You must have the wrong number." "Oh, my apologies," the voice continued, unfazed. "Still, how are things at my apartment street name?" My heart skipped. The street name was mine, but I hadn't mentioned it. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice sharper now. "Just a mix-up," the voice said lightly, ignoring my question. "Take care and enjoy your show." The line went dead before I could respond. I stared at the phone, a chill creeping up my spine. How could they know that? Dismissing it as a prank, I tried to shake off the unease. But that night, I found myself double-checking my locks before going to bed. The next day, the phone buzzed again, another unknown number. This time, I hesitated before answering. When I did, the same calm voice greeted me. "I see you took my advice and locked up last night. Smart." "Who are you? What do you want?" I demanded, gripping the phone tightly. "You'll figure it out," the voice replied cryptically. "By the way, how's the coffee at that cafe on 7th? You go there often, don't you?" I froze. That cafe was my regular spot, but I couldn't recall seeing anyone unusual there. My head swirled with questions, but before I could ask any, the line went dead again. The calls kept coming, each one from a different number, each one more intrusive. The voice described my daily activities, places I had been, and even mentioned private details about my life that no stranger could know. My sense of safety crumbled. Whoever this was, they were watching me. By the end of the week, I couldn't ignore the feeling of being followed. I started noticing small things. An unfamiliar car parked near my apartment building, its occupant obscured behind tinted windows. A figure lingering across the street as I walked home, disappearing the moment I glanced in their direction. At night, the sensation worsened. Shadows shifted in the corners of my vision, and faint noises outside my window made sleep nearly impossible. I tried calling the numbers back, but each one was disconnected or went to a dead end. When I told a coworker about the calls, they laughed it off. "Probably some prankster," they said. "Block the number and forget about it." But I couldn't forget. The fear was too real, the details too specific. Whoever was behind this wasn't just messing with me. They were inside my life, digging into places I hadn't realized were vulnerable. The final call came late one night as I was preparing for bed. The voice greeted me casually, as if we were old friends. "That blue sweater suits you," it said. My blood ran cold. I was wearing a blue sweater. I glanced around the room, searching for a sign of how they could possibly know that. My windows were shut, the curtains drawn, but it felt as though their eyes were on me, watching from the shadows. "You can't keep running from this," the voice continued. "But you can visit if you'd like. I'm closer than you think." I slammed the phone down, heart racing. This wasn't just someone watching from afar. They were near. Too near. I packed a bag in a frenzy and called my cousin, who lived in a remote countryside home. "I need to get away for a while," I said, my voice trembling. "Can I stay with you?" They didn't ask questions, just told me to come. That night, I left the city, my every glance in the rearview mirror haunted by the thought of being followed. The drive to my cousin's house was long, the winding roads growing narrower as the city lights faded into the distance. The countryside was quiet, its vast fields and dense woods offering a stark contrast to the oppressive closeness of my apartment. By the time I arrived, it was well past midnight. My cousin Sarah greeted me with a warm hug and a cup of tea, her farmhouse glowing softly under the moonlight. "You'll be safe here," she assured me, showing me to a guest room. The house was old but cozy, with creaking wooden floors and thick curtains that blocked out the night. For the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of relief. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds and sunlight streaming through the window. The tranquility of the countryside was soothing. I spent the day helping Sarah with small chores, feeding the chickens, stacking firewood, and preparing dinner. It felt good to be disconnected from the chaos I'd left behind. But that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the sense of safety began to waver. Standing on the porch, I thought I saw movement in the woods, a flicker of shadow too quick to be natural. I dismissed it as an animal, but the unease lingered. The second night brought no peace. As I lay in bed, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. The screen lit up with an unfamiliar number. My heart sank as I stared at it, dread pooling in my stomach. I answered, hoping against hope that it was a mistake. "You can run, but I'll always find you," the voice said, calm and confident. "The countryside suits you, though. That little yellow house, it's charming." I bolted upright, my breath hitching. They were here. Somehow they had followed me. I glanced out the window, but the darkness revealed nothing. The caller hung up before I could respond, leaving me shaking and wide-eyed in the quiet room. The next morning, Sarah mentioned something strange. She had found footprints in the dirt near the back porch, too large to be hers, too fresh to be old. She asked if I had gone outside during the night. I shook my head, my unease now a crushing weight. The calls continued, the voice now referencing details about the farmhouse, the creak of the stairs, the way the kitchen smelled of herbs, and even Sarah's habit of leaving the back door unlocked. Whoever this was, they weren't just watching me. They were here. By the third night, the tension was unbearable. Sarah suggested we call the police, but I knew it would be useless. Whoever was behind this left no evidence beyond the calls, and their methods seemed designed to instill fear rather than leave a trace. Desperate for answers, I began searching the house for anything that could explain how they knew so much. That's when I found it, a small, inconspicuous device tucked behind a picture frame in the living room. It was a camera, no bigger than a coin, its lens pointed toward the main entrance. My blood ran cold as I realized the truth. The calls weren't just threats, they were watching us, every moment through hidden devices scattered around the house. I found another one under the edge of the dining table and a third in the guest room where I slept. I showed the cameras to Sarah, her face pale with shock. "We have to leave," I said, my voice shaking. "They're already here." Before we could decide what to do, my phone buzzed again. The voice on the other end was quieter this time, almost a whisper. "You shouldn't have found those." We didn't waste time. Grabbing only what we could carry, we left the house in a rush, the heavy night pressing in around us. Sarah drove while I kept watch, scanning the rearview mirror for any sign of pursuit. The countryside, once peaceful, now felt suffocating, its dark woods hiding unseen threats. We reached the nearest town by dawn and checked into a motel, too scared to return to Sarah's house. I called the police, reporting the cameras and the calls, but their response was lukewarm at best. Without tangible evidence of who was behind it, there was little they could do. The highway stretched endlessly ahead of me, its dark, unbroken path illuminated only by my headlights. It was well past midnight, and I was nearing the final leg of my journey home. The road had been empty for miles. No cars ahead, none behind, just the monotonous hum of the engine and the occasional flicker of distant streetlights. My fuel gauge had dipped dangerously close to empty, so when the faint glow of a gas station appeared on the horizon, I took it as a sign of good fortune. Pulling into the station, I noticed how eerily quiet it was. The place looked forgotten, as if it hadn't seen much use in years. A single flickering neon sign buzzed above the pumps, and the surrounding lot was enveloped in shadows. The attendant, a middle-aged man slouched behind a smudged window, barely looked up as I approached the pump. I stepped out of the car, the cold night air biting against my skin. The silence felt heavier now, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the pump as it dispensed fuel. The station had an air of neglect, overgrown weeds along the pavement, a faint odor of mildew lingering in the air. My nerves began to prickle with unease, though I dismissed it as fatigue. Long drives had a way of making you imagine things. After finishing, I paid quickly, eager to get back on the road. The attendant still didn't acknowledge me, his eyes glued to some ancient television playing static. I returned to the car, the sense of isolation clinging to me as I started the engine. The hum of the heater provided little comfort as I merged back onto the highway. The road resumed its endless stretch into darkness, bordered by looming trees on either side. I focused on the lane ahead, the hypnotic rhythm of the dotted lines lulling me into a state of detachment. My mind wandered aimlessly, thinking about home, about the errands waiting for me in the morning. Instinctively, my eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. That's when I saw it. A figure, sitting in the back seat. My heart nearly stopped. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached, and the car swerved briefly onto the shoulder before I corrected it. My breathing quickened as panic flooded every inch of my body. I couldn't bring myself to look again. For a moment, I thought I was imagining things, but the faint outline of the figure remained etched in my mind. Gathering every ounce of courage, I slowed the car and pulled over onto the shoulder. My hands trembled as I shifted the gear into park and turned to confront whoever, or whatever, was in the back seat. The sight confirmed my worst fear. A person sat there, cloaked in shadows, their features barely discernible in the dim light. My heart pounded as I struggled to form a coherent thought. The figure leaned forward slightly, their face now partially visible in the faint glow of the dashboard. It was a man, pale and gaunt, with an intensity in his eyes that froze me in place. Before I could speak or scream, he raised a hand, motioning for me to stay calm. "Please," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Keep driving." I couldn't move, let alone respond. My mind raced, trying to process how he had gotten into my car. The doors had been locked. I was alone at the gas station. How was this possible? "Someone's following me," he added, his voice trembling now. "If we stay here, they'll catch up. Please, just drive." His words made no sense, yet the desperation in his tone sent a chill down my spine. Against my better judgment, and perhaps out of sheer terror, I shifted the car into drive and pulled back onto the road. The man sat silently in the back, his gaze fixed on something beyond the rear window. My pulse thundered in my ears as I drove into the darkness. The road seemed darker now, the trees more oppressive, as if the entire world had shrunk around the car. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by the sound of tires on asphalt. My grip on the wheel tightened as I fought the urge to look back at the stranger sitting behind me. Then I noticed it, a pair of headlights in the rearview mirror. At first I thought it was just another car, a rare traveler on this desolate stretch of highway, but the headlights grew closer, unnervingly fast. They were tailing us. The man shifted in his seat, his body tense. "It's them," he muttered, almost to himself. The headlights swerved suddenly, flashing into my rearview mirror, almost blinding me. The pursuing car was now inches from my bumper, its engine roaring as it matched my speed. My mind raced, panic threatening to overtake me as I tried to think of a way to escape. I pressed the gas pedal harder, but the car behind me followed suit, its driver clearly intent on catching up. The road twisted and turned, my tires skidding slightly on the curves. Every instinct screamed at me to stop, to confront the madness head-on, but something about the stranger's urgency kept me moving forward. And then I remembered the shortcut, a treacherous dirt road I hadn't taken in years. It was risky, but it might be my only chance. Without thinking, I veered sharply to the right, leaving the main road behind. The car jolted violently as I turned onto the dirt road, its uneven surface battering the suspension. The roar of the engine and the crunch of gravel under the tires filled the cabin, drowning out my ragged breathing. My headlights barely illuminated the path ahead, their beams swallowed by the dense forest crowding the road. The shortcut was narrow and winding, and I struggled to keep the car steady. In the rearview mirror, the headlights of the pursuer's car wavered as it followed me onto the dirt road. My heart sank. They were still behind us, undeterred by the treacherous terrain. The man in the back seat leaned forward, gripping the headrest of the passenger seat. "Faster," he said, his voice a harsh whisper. "They'll catch up." I gritted my teeth, the wheels skidding as I pushed the car harder. The shortcut was barely a road at all, more like a forgotten trail. Overgrown branches scraped against the windows, their clawing sound adding to the chaos. The car behind us grew closer, its headlights casting erratic shadows through the trees. A sharp curve loomed ahead, and I nearly missed it. The tires screeched as I swerved, narrowly avoiding a ditch. The pursuing car wasn't as lucky. I caught a glimpse of its headlights veering off the path, disappearing into the underbrush with a sickening crunch. Relief surged through me, but it was short-lived. The stranger's urgency hadn't faded. "Keep going," he said, his tone as sharp as ever. "We're not safe yet." The dirt road seemed to stretch on forever, winding deeper into the forest. Just as I began to wonder if I'd made a mistake taking this route, the trees parted, revealing a small, isolated village. It was barely a cluster of buildings, weathered houses with sagging roofs and darkened windows, surrounded by an oppressive silence. The place felt abandoned, forgotten by time. The man in the back seat straightened. "Stop here," he said. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to keep driving, but something in his tone left no room for argument. I brought the car to a halt near the edge of the village, the engine idling loudly in the stillness. He opened the door and stepped out, his movements deliberate but hurried. Without looking back at me, he headed toward the nearest building. Its door was slightly ajar, swaying gently in the breeze. The shadows swallowed him as he disappeared inside, leaving me alone in the car. A wave of unease washed over me. The village felt wrong, its emptiness oppressive, as though the very air carried the weight of unseen eyes. I didn't want to stay here a moment longer. Shifting the car into gear, I prepared to leave, but a part of me lingered, watching the house where the man had vanished. No light flickered on, no sound came from within. The shortcut's dirt road stretched before me once more, as I retraced my route back to the main highway. The car's headlights cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and the occasional burst of overgrown brush. The village faded into the distance behind me, but the feeling of being watched clung to me like a second skin. The silence in the car was deafening now. My thoughts raced, replaying the night's events over and over, trying to make sense of them. How had the man gotten into my car? Who was chasing him? And why did that village, in all its isolation, feel so suffocating? The rearview mirror became my enemy, each glance into it bringing with it the irrational fear of seeing something or someone again. But the back seat remained empty, and no headlights appeared on the road behind me. Despite this, the sense of unease refused to lift. Every shadow seemed to move in the corner of my vision, every rustle in the trees a threat. When I finally reached the main road, the relief was immediate but shallow. The highway stretched before me once more, empty and unyielding, but at least familiar. I accelerated, eager to leave the night behind. The air was crisp, with just a hint of lingering warmth from the day's sun. I had decided to step out for an evening walk, something I hadn't done in weeks. The streets were quiet, just the way I liked them. Few cars passed, and even fewer people were out. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hum of a streetlight buzzing faintly in the gathering dusk. I stuck to my usual route, a quiet neighborhood loop that skirted the edge of a small wooded park. The path was familiar, the kind of place where I felt safe letting my mind wander. My thoughts were light, a mix of planning for the next day and enjoying the rare moment of solitude. As I rounded a bend, I noticed something odd up ahead. There, at the far end of the street, stood a figure. They were too far away for me to make out any details, but they were unmistakably human, motionless under the dim glow of a street lamp. I paused briefly, more out of curiosity than concern, and then continued on my way. People loitered sometimes, waiting for rides or enjoying the cool air, and I had no reason to think otherwise. Still, something about how still they stood made me glance back after a few steps. They hadn't moved. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to a trick of the fading light, and focused on the path ahead. The air seemed heavier now, though I couldn't say why. I kept walking, my pace steady, the figure fading from my thoughts, until I glanced back again. My breath caught. They were closer. I stopped mid-step, my sneakers scraping against the pavement. The figure, still standing under a different street lamp now, had somehow halved the distance between us. They were still motionless, their bodies silhouetted against the faint orange glow of the light above them. I stared for a moment, my mind scrambling for an explanation. Maybe they had moved when I wasn't looking. Maybe it was someone heading home or walking in the same direction. That made sense. I almost laughed at myself, feeling foolish for letting my imagination run wild. But as I resumed walking, I felt the first prickle of unease creeping up my spine. I quickened my pace, telling myself it was nothing. Just a random stranger. Nothing to worry about. Still, I didn't dare look back again for a long stretch. I turned onto a new street, hoping the change in direction would ease my nerves. The houses here were spaced farther apart, their windows dark and unwelcoming. The streetlights were fewer, casting long, uneven shadows across the cracked pavement. I tried to focus on my breathing, on the steady rhythm of my steps, but the urge to look back gnawed at me. I gave in. My stomach dropped. The figure was there again, at the corner I just turned from. Closer now, standing at the edge of the light, their features still obscured by shadow. I froze, my pulse racing. I couldn't see their face, but the way they stood, so still, so silent, made it impossible to mistake them for an ordinary passerby. I tore my eyes away, forcing myself to keep walking. My steps were faster now, almost hurried, but I resisted the urge to run. Running would make me look ridiculous, or worse, make me seem like prey. The silence pressed in around me, amplifying every sound. My own footsteps seemed too loud, my breathing too harsh. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, but the undeniable fact remained. Every time I looked back, the figure was closer. By now, the calm of the evening had vanished completely. The street felt oppressive, its shadows darker, its silence more menacing. I told myself I was overreacting, that this was some harmless coincidence, but my body wasn't convinced. My muscles tensed with every step, and my heart raced as though trying to keep pace with my growing fear. I dared another glance over my shoulder. The figure had moved again, closer still. They stood at the edge of the next streetlight, their outlines sharper now. They wore dark clothes, blending into the night, and their posture was unnaturally stiff. I couldn't see their face, but I could feel their gaze fixed on me. Panic surged, and I quickened my pace, my shoes slapping against the pavement. The rational part of my mind screamed that this was absurd. People didn't just appear closer without moving. It wasn't possible, but it was happening. I turned onto yet another street, one that curved slightly uphill. My chest burned as I climbed, the incline stealing my breath. The figure was still there when I looked back, standing perfectly still at the base of the hill. For a moment, I considered calling out to them, demanding to know what they wanted, but the words caught in my throat. Something about them felt wrong, in a way that defied logic. Instead, I broke into a jog, my fear finally outweighing my pride. The stillness of the figure was more terrifying than if they'd been chasing me outright. It was as though the act of moving was beneath them, as if their silent approach was inevitable, no matter what I did. The jog turned into a full sprint. My feet pounded against the pavement as I tore up the hill, my breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts. The night seemed to close in around me, the world narrowing to just the street ahead, and the oppressive knowledge that something was wrong behind me. I didn't dare glance back. I couldn't. Instead, I focused on the sound of my own footsteps, the rhythmic slap of sneakers on asphalt. Each step felt too loud, too exposed, as if it might draw attention to my retreat. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop. The need to put distance between myself and the figure was the only thing that mattered. At the top of the hill, the street forked. To the left was the main road, well lit but deserted this late at night. To the right, a narrow footpath led through a small park. It was shorter, a direct route home, but it was dark and overgrown, the kind of place I'd normally avoid after sunset. Desperation made the decision for me. I veered onto the footpath, the darkness swallowing me almost immediately. The gravel crunched beneath my shoes, and the trees overhead cast fractured shadows across the ground. I felt exposed despite the cover, as if the darkness itself was working against me. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of branches felt amplified, like the forest was alive and watching. The shortcut was risky, but I knew it well. If I could just keep going, I'd be home soon. Still, the thought nagged at the back of my mind. Had I lost the figure, or were they still there, somehow closer than before? The path twisted through the park, its uneven surface forcing me to slow down. My breathing was loud in the stillness, every exhale a harsh reminder of my vulnerability. The trees loomed taller here, their branches intertwining to form a dense canopy that blocked out even the faintest light. I hadn't looked back once since entering the park, too afraid of what I might see. But the silence became unbearable. I had to know. I stopped, my chest heaving, and turned around. There they were. The figure stood at the edge of the path, no more than 20 feet away. My blood turned to ice. They hadn't moved, not that I could see, but they were unmistakably closer now, their outlines sharp and imposing in the gloom. Their stillness was unnatural, as if they were a statue carved out of the shadows themselves. My legs trembled, but I forced myself to move, stumbling backward before turning to run again. The path felt endless now, the trees stretching on in every direction. No matter how fast I moved, the sense of being watched clung to me like a second skin. I didn't dare look back again. I just ran. The path finally opened up, spitting me out onto a quiet residential street. My legs wobbled beneath me as I slowed to a jog, then a walk, gulping in air as I tried to calm my racing heart. For a moment, the relief was overwhelming. I was out of the park, back in familiar territory. The houses here were spaced apart but lit, their windows glowing softly with signs of life. I allowed myself a glance over my shoulder, certain that I'd left the figure behind. I was wrong. They stood at the edge of the path, perfectly still, perfectly silent. My stomach dropped. They weren't supposed to be here. They weren't supposed to be able to follow me. Yet there they were, as if the rules of distance and time didn't apply to them. The street stretched ahead of me, an open invitation to escape. I broke into another run, my body protesting with every step. My mind was a whirlwind of panic, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was this real? Was I losing my grip on reality? I reached the end of the street and turned onto another, barely noticing the houses and streetlights anymore. My focus was singular. Keep moving. I didn't stop, didn't look back, didn't think. I just ran, hoping against hope that I could leave the figure behind for good. By the time I reached my house, I was a wreck. My breath came in shallow gasps, my legs barely able to carry me up the front steps. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly it took several tries before I could fit the key into the lock. When the door finally opened, I slammed it shut behind me and locked it, twisting the deadbolt for good measure.